Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a real pleasure to follow the honourable member, the chair of the Select Committee, of which I'm proud to be a member. And I'm delighted that we have this debate today, and I pay tribute to the two honourable members who secured it. It is, as my honourable friend has said, the most important issue. In fact, in an effort to chip away at my gigantic constituency majority in Richmond Park and North Kingston, one or two local opponents enjoy telling my constituents that I care more about the environment and climate change than I do about Brexit. Well, they're right. I do, for all the reasons we just heard, so they can stick that on their leaflets. This is already a year of records. We've had last year. In fact, I'm going to start with last year. We had record snowfall in March. We had, in this country, we had the joint hottest summer on record. 2 days ago, I believe, was a record for any February ever. Clearly, you can't attribute individual weather extremes or events to climate change. It's just not scientific, it's not possible, but the trends do tell a story. The most recent Met Office report in November last year tells us that the UK is experiencing an increase in weather extremes. Hottest days have become hotter, the number of warm spells have increased, the coldest days are not as cold, there's been an increase in rainfall levels. None of it individually is catastrophic, but it is a sign, and globally the signs are even more alarming. The 5 warmest years in recorded history have been since 2010. 2014 was the hottest year ever recorded until 2015. 2015 year became the record year until 2016. And then in 2016, which was at the time the warmest year on record, of the 12 months, 8 were the warmest the individual month has ever seen in history. So the implications of all this, if the science is right, are truly alarming. Ecosystems forced through such rapid changes that they are unlikely to be able to adapt. Lands becoming harder and harder to farm. Refugees on a scale we have never had to deal with before as a species. We heard in an intervention from the member from West Dorset about Bangladesh, probably the most extreme example, probably the most alarming example. In fact, we should commit right here and now to trying to secure a debate on the issue. It's extraordinary that we haven't debated it. But Bangladesh is just one among other examples. The UNHCR estimates that an average of 21.5 million people are already displaced each year because of weather-related sudden onset hazards. That is a figure that can only grow if any of these predictions are correct. And then last year's IPCC report painted, I think, the most alarming picture yet. The Paris Agreement of 2015, if you remember, commits the world to a target of limiting global warming to 2 degrees. Well, that report looked at the difference between what we can expect if we achieve the 2 degrees target and what we can expect if we limit increases instead to 1.5 degrees. It tells us that the number of people exposed to water stress would be 50% lower if we kept to 1.5 degrees. It tells us that half a degree would mean hundreds of millions fewer people, particularly in the world's poorest countries, being at risk of climate-related destitution. The half-degree extra warming would lead to a forecasted 10 centimetre additional pressure on our coastlines. That half degree is the difference between losing all of our corals and managing to hold on to 10% of them. I will.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he, thank you. Would the honourable member acknowledge that the IPCC report for 1.5 degrees centigrade has said that we need to make those reductions to our greenhouse emissions by 2030? Unfortunately, the government is telling the Climate Change Committee that it can't look at that reduction until 2050. That, to me, seems a little bit late in the day.
And I thank him for his intervention. I will address exactly that point very, very shortly. I just want to conclude on the IPCC, because currently, if you look at the trends, we're not heading for that apocalyptic 2 degrees centigrade rise. We're heading towards something that looks more like 3 degrees, the consequences of which we can't possibly estimate. And in that light, the idea that children missing a few hours of geometry or PE in order to ring the alarm bells and wake our political system up is somehow a wasted opportunity or the wrong thing to do just seems churlish. It seems absurd and mean-minded. Yes, please.
I'm very grateful, right honourable friend. He is, of course, on the central issue. But, of course, this is a global problem that he's referring to, and it has only a global solution because what we're talking about is 2.6 billion people in China and India, for the first time in 250 years, returning to the historic norm of occupying half of global GDP, with massive consequences for energy consumption and other things. And would he agree with me that, therefore, we need not just to talk about our own activities, indeed the activities of the West, but also the question of how we restructure the international order, which is probably the biggest challenge actually facing the Western world and the Eastern world at present?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with him more. And the final remarks I'm going to make will relate partially to the point that my right honourable friend has just made, but he's right. And for those countries that haven't yet developed in the sense that we have, it would be madness for them to develop in such a way that required them to become addicted to the same system that is causing this problem, whereas they have an opportunity now to leapfrog into a much cleaner, leaner, more efficient future. The technology is there. Now, as my honourable friend, the member for Newbury, right honourable member for Newbury, pointed out earlier, there are still doubters. And of course, we can quibble with the predictions because climate systems are complex. There isn't a computer model on Earth capable of fully taking on board the complexity of the natural world, fully taking on board the realities of positive and negative feedbacks that impact on climate. But we are nevertheless faced with what is a pretty simple calculation. What happens if we ignore that overwhelming scientific consensus and listen instead to those skeptics and are then wrong? Well, the IPCC predictions have told us that we'd be risking life on Earth as we know it. We'd be risking civilization. What happens instead if we listen to that consensus, we take action and are wrong? Well, by accident, we'd end up with a cleaner and eventually cheaper energy system. We'd end up protecting more of the world's forests and ecosystems. We'd end up with an economic system that was more circular, less wasteful. It really isn't a difficult calculation to make, and even more so given that almost everything we need to do to tackle climate change is something we need to do irrespective of climate change. The challenge is gigantic, and no one doubts that. If we're to meet that 1.5 degrees centigrade total global emissions, we're told we'd need to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. But we can do it, and it is worth highlighting, in fairness to the government, that we are already making progress. Not enough, but progress all the same. We've already heard about the World-Leading Climate Change Act. I'm not going to dwell on that, but since 2010, the UK has reduced emissions by 23%. We've reduced emissions faster than any other G7 nation. The government's now delighted to acknowledge and instructed the Committee on Climate Change to look at how we can go further and move to a net zero emissions target. But it also needs to be said that at the current rate of progress, despite having met the early targets, we're on course to meet the next one, we are not on course to meet the fourth and fifth carbon budgets. And so we do have a long way to go. Now, clearly, we are going to have to change much of what we do, not just in terms of how we generate electricity, but in how we use it, how we manage land, how we organize ourselves in terms of transport, food, and industry. And there has long been a belief, a fear, that there must be a direct correlation between emissions and economic growth. And that has been true for most of the past of the Industrial Revolution. There has been a direct link. Emissions go up, growth goes up. But it's not so clear now. Since 1990, we've cut emissions in this country by 42%, even while our economy has grown by 2/3. And as we enter this gigantic economic transition, there will be, of course, losers, the polluters, but there will also be winners. Last year saw a record amount of power generated from renewable sources, with over 30% coming from renewables. A much quicker transition to electric vehicles, something we really need to push on, will mean more jobs, will mean more investment. Supporting new clean technologies means jobs and investments. And that transition, incidentally, is going to happen, whether we like it or not. It's the old story of the whale oil. Whale oil in 1850. Every home in America was lit by whale oil. And then was it Edwin Drake, 9 years later, struck oil. And we had the oil rush. And almost immediately after the oil rush began, the whale oil sector simply evaporated. And there was a cutting in a diary of the biggest whale oil trader at the time who said, "I'm astonished that I've run out of customers before I ran out of whales." That is what is going to happen. Old industries, old technologies, they're going to give way to new ones. And it is in our interest as a country to lead the charge. Honourable members have covered lots of areas that we need to get going. But I just want to focus on one last point, which I think has been neglected in almost all of the debates we have on climate change, and that's forests. Apart from transport, deforestation is the single largest source of emissions. Deforestation accounts for around 20%, a fifth of all carbon emissions. They're one of the world's largest carbon sinks. They absorb around 2.5 billion tons of carbon a year. They store many billions more. But we are losing 18.7 million acres of forest every year, the equivalent of 27 football pitches every single minute. And it is self-evident madness that this is happening, not just because of climate change, of course, The forests provide us with clean air, with water, with soils. Their influence on world weather patterns we don't fully understand, but we know that it is defining. They're home to 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. Over 1.5 billion people depend directly on forests for. And that needs to be a priority. And I think the UK can be proud that we are the only nation in the G7 and indeed the G20 to hit the UN targets on overseas aid last year, the year before last. We were the only country, but a tiny fraction of that overseas aid, as little as 0.4%, goes towards nature. And I think we can do much more than that. The aim of that department, the purpose of that existence of that department, is to tackle poverty. But the surest way to plunge people into desperate base poverty is by removing the environments and ecosystems and the free services that nature provides that those people directly depend on. Of course, the world's poorest people depend much more directly on nature than we do here in this house. But we all ultimately depend on the natural world. So in addition to being at the forefront, I will.
Grateful that the honourable gentleman giving way. I think he's right that this country needs to help developing countries, and one of the best ways we can do it is using our expertise in organisations like the Met Office, Kew Gardens in his constituency, where we have some of the world's greatest scientists, and we can work with other countries to make sure they can adapt and indeed mitigate climate change.
He's exactly right, and I love that he mentioned Kew Gardens, and I thank him for that. I'm trying to push through a private member's bill. It keeps being blocked by the honourable member for Christchurch. Kew boos from people, anyone who happens to be watching this programme, this discussion. And it would actually deliver about 40 or 50 million pounds extra to Kew Gardens without dipping into the public purse. And it would enable them to do exactly the work that he's just mentioned, much of which focuses on helping developing countries, poorer countries, adapt to the reality and the risks of climate change. They do extraordinary work, and I'm grateful to him for putting that on the record. So I'm going to finish by saying, in addition to being at the forefront of the new net zero revolution, which is what it is, let us also be world leaders in restoring ecosystems on a scale that finally matches the problem. Thank you very much.